Imagine a man whose very name made empires tremble. A man who left behind fields of bones so vast they could be seen from miles away, yet also raised cities so magnificent they still shine like jewels in the desert. Was he a savior of civilization or its greatest destroyer? In the heart of Central Asia, a crippled warrior rose from obscurity. He swore to carve his name into history with fire and steel. His ambition knew no borders, his cruelty knew no limits, and his empire, though brief, would echo through centuries. This is the story of Timur, known to the West as Tamerlane, the conqueror who dreamed of ruling the world and whose shadow still haunts history. The 14th century was an age of chaos. Empires once mighty had fractured into dust. The Mongol storm that had swept across Asia and Europe was fading, leaving behind broken lands, shattered cities, and hungry warlords fighting for scraps of power. The Silk Road, once a lifeline of trade and culture, had become a trail of blood. In this world of uncertainty, where kingdoms rose and fell with the swing of a sword, a boy was born in the barren steppes of Transoxiana. Crippled in his youth, dismissed as weak, he should have been forgotten by history. But he was not. From these scars rose Timur, the Iron, a man who would bend destiny itself to his will. His empire would be built on conquest and fire, but his legacy would be written stone and beauty. To some, he was the sword of God. To others, the scourge of the world. This is his story. Before we dive deeper into the rise of Timur and the empire he carved in blood and brilliance, make sure you subscribe to History Vault. Join us as we uncover the hidden stories, forgotten empires, and powerful figures that shaped our world. Now, let us return to the steppes, where Timur's legend begins. The story begins in the wind-swept lands of Central Asia, a place of endless steppes and shifting sands, where nomadic tribes had roamed for centuries. It was the mid-14th century, and the world was in turmoil. The great Mongol Empire, once the largest the world had ever known, had splintered into pieces. Its power had faded, and what remained was a patchwork of khanates and local rulers struggling for survival. Cities that once thrived on the Silk Road now stood vulnerable, caught between rival factions. Trade routes faltered, and the once mighty flow of wealth between East and West slowed to a crawl. This was a world where power was fragile, and strength often came from the sharp edge of a sword. It was in this environment of uncertainty that Timur was born in 1336, near the city of Kesh, not far from Samarkand. His people, the Balas, were Turkic in culture but carried the heritage of the Mongols in their blood. They were remnants of the once dominant armies of Genghis Khan that had settled in the region and gradually adopted the traditions of the Persian and Islamic worlds around them. Timur's childhood, however, was far from the life of privilege one might imagine for a boy who would later claim the title of world conqueror. As a teenager, fate struck him with an injury that would leave its mark forever. He was wounded by arrows. One pierced his leg, another his hand. The injuries never fully healed. He walked with a limp, and his right hand lost much of its strength. Because of this, many mocked him, calling him Timur the Lame. In Persian, this would be Tamerlane, a name that in time became known to the world as Tamerlane. Yet what might have ended another man's dreams only hardened Timur's resolve. If his body was marked by weakness, his mind became sharper, stronger, and more dangerous. Growing up in the unforgiving steppes meant that survival was a daily challenge. The tribes around him lived by the sword, and young Timur learned early that cunning often outweighed brute force. He quickly discovered that alliances could shift overnight, that a friend could turn into an enemy with little warning, and that to survive, one needed not only courage but also patience and strategy. These lessons would become the foundation of his rise. Timur began his path as a warrior in the service of local chiefs, fighting as a mercenary and winning the loyalty of men around him. Even then, he displayed qualities that set him apart. He was ruthless in battle, calculating in negotiation, and above all, relentless in his ambition. He had a gift for leadership, able to inspire his followers with promises of wealth, victory, and glory. Slowly but surely, he gathered around him a band of loyal warriors who would form the backbone of his future armies. But Timur's rise was not simply about warfare. He was as skilled in politics as he was with the sword. He learned how to use marriages, treaties, and symbolic ties to strengthen his position. He claimed descent from Genghis Khan by marrying into the family of the great conqueror, a move that gave him a cloak of legitimacy in a region where Mongol heritage still carried immense weight. By doing so, Timur could present himself not just as a warlord, but as the rightful heir to the Mongol tradition of empire. The world around him, however, was not stable. Rival tribes fought for dominance, and cities rose and fell in rapid succession. Timur's early years as a leader were marked by constant conflict, betrayal, and shifting allegiances. But these very struggles refined his skills. He became a master of deception, knowing when to wait and when to strike, when to ally and when to betray. Each decision was a step closer to the power he sought. By the 1360s, Timur had begun to emerge as more than just a tribal leader. He had set his eyes on Samarkand, a city of immense strategic and cultural value. Samarkand was not only a jewel of the Silk Road, connecting the East and West, but it was also a city with deep symbolic importance. To control Samarkand meant more than holding a capital. It meant commanding the crossroads of civilization. Timur seized the opportunity. Through force, cunning, and sheer determination, he established Samarkand as his base. It would become both the heart of his empire and the canvas on which he would later build his vision of grandeur. Yet the path was far from secure. Even with Samarkand under his control, Timur's enemies surrounded him. Rival warlords, jealous allies, and hostile tribes all threatened to undo what he had built. But Timur thrived in this environment. He believed that chaos was not an obstacle, but an opportunity. He used fear to keep rivals at bay, rewarding loyalty but punishing betrayal with brutal efficiency, step by step. He transformed from a wounded boy mocked for his limp into a ruler whose very name began to inspire both awe and dread. Still, it was his vision that set him apart. Timur was not content with being another warlord of the steppes. He did not want a fleeting throne or a temporary kingdom. He dreamed of building an empire to rival that of Genghis Khan himself. In his mind, the fractured world around him was waiting for a new conqueror to rise, and he believed he was chosen to fill that role. This dream was not just about conquest. Timur saw himself as the instrument of destiny, a man who could unite the steppe under one banner and revive the glory of the past. He spoke of bringing order where there was chaos, of reviving trade along the Silk Road, and of building cities that would shine as beacons of culture and faith. But behind this vision was also a relentless hunger for power, a desire to carve his name into history through both fear and magnificence. By the late 1360s, Timur had secured his power in Transoxiana. Samarkand stood as his capital, and his reputation was growing. Across the steppes and beyond, whispers spread of the warlord who limped but never faltered, who could outthink his enemies and outfight his rivals. The world had seen many conquerors, but Timur was different. He was not merely seeking survival, he was preparing to launch a storm. From this foundation, Timur would set out on campaigns that would stretch across Asia, into Persia, India, and even the edges of Europe. But the rise of Timur was more than just the story of a boy becoming a king. It was the making of a legend, forged in blood, ambition, and the belief that destiny was his to command. The steppe had given him scars, but it had also given him strength. From obscurity, he had climbed to power. From weakness, he had built a reputation that sent shivers through distant lands. The crippled warrior of Transoxiana was ready to unveil his true power, and soon the world would learn his name. Once Timur had secured his base in Samarkand, he turned his eyes outward. Power in Central Asia alone was never going to be enough for a man who believed his destiny was written in conquest. The steppe had taught him survival, but now he sought domination. What began as raids soon became campaigns, and what began as ambition soon grew into an empire. Timur believed that fear could be a weapon sharper than any sword, and he wielded it with precision. His enemies would come to learn that his armies did not simply defeat, they annihilated. The fractured world around him offered endless opportunities. The Chagatai Khanate, once powerful, was weakened by rival factions. Timur crushed his rivals and tightened his control, presenting himself not just as a local strongman, but as the champion of order. By securing Transoxiana and Samarkand, he had gained the beating heart of the Silk Road. From here, his armies could strike in every direction, and Timur wasted no time in proving that he would not be confined by borders. His first great campaigns were directed toward Persia. The lands of Iran had suffered decades of chaos after the Mongol Ilkhanate collapsed. Cities that once flourished were now torn apart by local rulers who fought among themselves. Timur marched in with his disciplined cavalry, hardened on the steppe and loyal only to him. Persian cities resisted, but one after another they fell. Isfahan, a jewel of Persian culture, tried to defy him. The result was brutal. Timur ordered a massacre so vast that, according to some chroniclers, tens of thousands were executed. Towers of skulls were built as warnings, a grim reminder that resistance meant annihilation. Yet Timur was not a man of mindless violence. Each act of terror was calculated. By destroying some, he forced others to surrender without a fight. His cruelty was deliberate, his message clear: submit, and you may live; resist, and you will be erased. This strategy spread his reputation far beyond the lands he actually conquered. Cities opened their gates in fear long before his armies arrived, terrified by the stories that preceded him. From Persia, Timur turned his armies north, where the Golden Horde still lingered. Once powerful, this branch of the Mongol Empire had begun to lose its grip. Timur clashed with Toktamish, the Khan of the Golden Horde, and won time ally. The rivalry would reshape the steppe. In the late 1380s, Timur marched against Toktamish with a massive army. The battles were fierce, with horsemen clashing across the plains, arrows filling the skies. Eventually, Timur triumphed, burning cities along the Volga and crippling the Golden Horde's power. This victory not only secured his northern frontier, but also opened new routes of trade and influence deeper into Russia. But Timur's ambition did not stop there. In 1398, he turned his attention toward India, a land of immense wealth and ancient splendor. The Delhi Sultanate was powerful but fractured, weakened by internal divisions. Timur's armies crossed the Indus and advanced toward Delhi with unstoppable momentum. The Sultan of Delhi tried to resist, but Timur's forces overwhelmed the defenders. What followed was one of the darkest chapters of his campaigns. Delhi was sacked, its population subjected to horrific massacres. Thousands were killed, and the once thriving city was left in ashes. For Timur, this was not only about wealth. It was about demonstrating that no kingdom, no matter how rich or distant, was beyond his reach. After India, Timur's gaze shifted westward. The Middle East had always been a crossroads of power, and there, the once proud cities of Damascus and Baghdad awaited his attention. In 1401, he marched into Mesopotamia and struck Baghdad. The city, long a center of culture and learning, was devastated. Chroniclers speak of rivers clogged with bodies, and entire quarters burned to the ground. Once again, towers of skulls were raised as monuments to his fury. Yet even as destruction followed his path, Timur collected scholars, artists, and craftsmen, transporting them back to Samarkand. His conquests spread fear, but they also fed his dream of building a capital unmatched in beauty. One of Timur's most dramatic confrontations came against the powerful Ottoman Empire. By the early 15th century, the Ottomans under Sultan Bayezid I were expanding rapidly into both Anatolia and the Balkans. A clash between Timur and Bayezid was inevitable. In 1402, the two forces met at the Battle of Ankara. The armies were immense, the tension immense. Timur's forces, well drilled and strategically maneuvered, overwhelmed the Ottomans. Bayezid himself was captured, humiliated by being kept in a cage. According to some accounts, the Ottoman advance into Europe was halted for years, and Timur's reputation reached its peak. He was no longer simply a conqueror of the East. He was a kingmaker whose power rivaled any ruler alive. Throughout these campaigns, Timur's style of war remained consistent. He used speed, deception, and overwhelming force. His cavalry moved swiftly, striking at supply lines and crushing resistance before it could gather. He combined traditional steppe tactics with clever innovations, adapting to the lands he invaded. More than once, he appeared where his enemies least expected, as if he could bend time and distance to his will. But behind the strategies and victories lay a darker truth. Timur's empire was not built for longevity. His rule relied on terror and constant expansion. Where he conquered, he often destroyed, leaving cities unable to recover for generations. His name spread fear, but fear cannot build stability. Still, in his lifetime, Timur's dominance seemed unstoppable. From the plains of Russia to the deserts of Persia, from the riches of India to the walls of Anatolia, his shadow stretched across continents. By the time Timur returned to Samarkand, his empire had grown vast, his wealth immense, and his legend unrivaled. Yet even as he sat in his grand palaces and admired the blue, tiled domes rising above his capital, his hunger for conquest remained unsatisfied. He began to dream of one final campaign, one last great march that would secure his place as the greatest conqueror since Genghis Khan. His target was China, the heart of the Ming dynasty. The conquests of fire and steel had made Timur feared across the world. His brutality was unmatched, his victories decisive, but his story was not yet finished. Even at the height of his power, he looked beyond the horizon, searching for the next empire to bring to its knees. The story of Timur does not end with the clash of steel or the fall of cities. It continues in the silent echo of palaces, in the intricate tiles of mosques, and in the whispered prayers of those who lived under his shadow. His reign left scars that ran deep, but it also gave rise to wonders that continue to amaze the world. This strange duality, blood and beauty, fear and brilliance, became the essence of the Timurid legacy. When Timur died in 1405 during a campaign aimed at China, his empire stretched across a vast and fragile arcs. From the steppes of Central Asia to the heart of Persia, and from the gates of Delhi to the edges of Anatolia. But like many empires carved through violence, it was held together not by lasting institutions, but by the will of one man. And when that will was gone, cracks began to spread, succession disputes ignited, and the lands he had once conquered with fire slipped into the hands of rivals. Yet, what survived was something Timur himself may not have expected. The city of Samarkand, which Timur had transformed into the jewel of his empire, became the vessel of his memory. It was here that he summoned artisans, architects, calligraphers, and scholars from every corner of his conquests. Some were brought willingly, many were brought by force, but together they created something astonishing. Towers rose against the desert sky, shimmering with blue and turquoise tiles. Domes were built so grand, they seemed to mirror the heavens themselves. To walk through Samarkand was to walk through Timur's vision of eternity, a vision that still stands centuries later. The story of Timur does not end with the clash of steel or the fall of cities. It continues in the silent echo of palaces, in the intricate tiles of mosques, and in the whispered prayers of those who lived under his shadow. His reign left scars that ran deep, but it also gave rise to wonders that continue to amaze the world. This strange duality, blood and beauty, fear and brilliance, became the essence of the Timurid legacy. When Timur died in 1405 during a campaign aimed at China, his empire stretched across a vast and fragile arcs. From the steppes of Central Asia to the heart of Persia, and from the gates of Delhi to the edges of Anatolia. But like many empires carved through violence, it was held together not by lasting institutions, but by the will of one man. And when that will was gone, cracks began to spread, succession disputes ignited, and the lands he had once conquered with fire slipped into the hands of rivals. Yet, what survived was something Timur himself may not have expected: the city of Samarkand, which Timur had transformed into the jewel of his empire, became the vessel of his memory. It was here that he summoned artisans, architects, calligraphers, and scholars from every corner of his conquests. Some were brought willingly, many were brought by force, but together they created something astonishing. Towers rose against the desert sky, shimmering with blue and turquoise tiles. Domes were built so grand, they seemed to mirror the heavens themselves. To walk through Samarkand was to walk through Timur's vision of eternity, a vision that still stands centuries later. His successors, though often embroiled in battles among themselves, carried forward this passion for art and culture. Timur's grandson, Ulugh Beg, became one of the most brilliant figures of the dynasty. Unlike his grandfather, Ulugh Beg was not remembered for conquest, but for knowledge. He built a great observatory in Samarkand, one of the most advanced of its time, where he and his scholars charted the stars with incredible precision. He created astronomical tables so accurate they would be used long after his death. The man who ruled an empire by blood left behind a descendant who ruled minds through the pursuit of wisdom. But even with these triumphs of knowledge and beauty, Timur's shadow of violence remained. Cities he destroyed never fully recovered. The memory of massacres haunted Persia and India. In Delhi, people whispered about the mountains of skulls left behind after his invasion. In Baghdad, stories lingered of his army's ruthless march. For many, Timur's name was not tied to beauty, but to devastation. It was a reminder that his empire was built on fear as much as on vision. This paradox is what makes Timur's legacy so compelling. Unlike Alexander the Great, who inspired myths of heroic conquest, or Genghis Khan, who was seen as a force of nature reshaping the world, Timur is remembered with a more uneasy balance. He was a builder and a destroyer, a patron of the arts and a master of terror. His empire collapsed within decades, yet his cultural influence stretched for centuries. even after the Timurids lost political control. Their artistic and intellectual heritage spread far beyond Central Asia. Persian art flourished under their rule, blending with local traditions to create works that would influence the Safavids in Iran and the Mughals in India. In fact, one of Timur's descendants, Babur, carried this legacy into India when he founded the Mughal Empire in the early 16th century. Through him, Timur's bloodline lived on, and the palaces of Agra and the Taj Mahal became extensions of the Timurid dream of beauty. In this way, Timur's vision travelled far beyond his own empire. His brutality may have silenced cities, but his love for grandeur and artistry ignited a fire that continued to burn long after. The shimmering domes of Samarkand, the knowledge written in Ulav Beg's star charts, the Mughal monuments in India, all of them trace their roots back to the man who believed he was chosen by destiny to rule the world. And yet, for all his triumphs and all his tragedies, Timur remained haunted by his own humanity. When he died, his body was laid to rest in the Gur-e, a mere mausoleum in Samarkand, a tome of astonishing beauty. Inscribed above his resting place were words of warning that whoever disturbed Timur's sleep would unleash a conqueror worse than him. Centuries later, when Soviet archaeologists opened his tomb in 1941, the world plunged into World War II just days after. Coincidence, perhaps. But for those who know the weight of history, it felt like the voice of Timur reaching out from the grave. The Timurid Empire did not last long on the maps of the world. But in memory, in art, and in legend, it never truly vanished. Timur's story is not a simple tale of power rising and falling. It is a mirror of human ambition at its highest and darkest. It shows us how beauty can be born from cruelty, how knowledge can grow from conquest, and how one man's vision, no matter how violent, can shape centuries of culture. As the sun sets over the domes of Samarkand, casting golden light across the turquoise tiles, the question remains, was Timur a visionary who elevated his people to greatness, or a tyrant who drowned nations in blood? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. What cannot be denied is that Timur's name still echoes, carried by the stones of his monuments and the whispers of his victims. A name that continues to remind the world of the thin line between destruction and creation, between horror and wonder. And so, the legacy of Timur and the Timurid Empire endures, not just as a chapter of history, but as a story of contrast that still fascinates, unsettles, and inspires. History remembers Timur as both a creator and a destroyer, a man whose empire burned bright but briefly, leaving behind monuments of dazzling beauty and memories of unspeakable bloodshed. His story forces us to ask, what is the true measure of greatness? Is it the size of an empire carved by the sword, or the cultural wonders that outlive the conqueror's shadow? As we stand centuries later, staring at the ruins of Samarkand and the tales whispered through time, one truth remains. Empires may fall, but stories endure. And it is in these stories that we uncover not just the past, but also reflections of our present and warnings for our future. If this journey into the life and legacy of Timur has sparked your curiosity, make sure to subscribe to History Vault. Here, we bring the hidden corners of history to light, stories of power, ambition, mystery, and the echoes they leave behind. Because the past is never silent. It waits, it watches, and it still has more to tell.